So I'm going to go here. JJ, so I meant between players, not between the creatures, as in who divides their damage first. As the defending player, can I get an advantage by knowing how my opponent is dividing their damage and divide my damage with that knowledge in mind? The short, yes, as essentially. Though the active player will always like damage assignment is always announced in turn order. So like if as the active player, I would announce how my creatures are dealing damage to your creatures before you would say how your creatures are dealing damage to mine. All right. So we picked up before our boosty break, we had just escaped the combat phase, the jungles of the combat phase.
Hashtag not just a step.
Hashtag not just a step. Um, and after that, there is another main phase. So after the combat phase, there's a second main phase. It's largely the same as your first main phase, except there are no turn-based actions associated with the second main phase.
At least not yet.
Yeah. Um, Now, the first main phase of your turn is always considered your pre-combat main phase, and any subsequent main phases after that are always considered post-combat main phases, even if you don't have a combat phase for one reason or another. Main phase one is always for like rules on cards that reference pre-combat main phase. That's the first main phase of the turn, and post combat main phases, any main phases two through however many else you may get from cards that give you additional main phases. Um, all right, we love a good main phase. Next, we get into the ending phase, and this is the final phase of the turn. The ending phase consists of two steps, the first of which is the end step. Now, the end step is a lot like an upkeep step, but for the end of your turn. There's no turn based actions associated with this step, but there's a whole host of cards that have abilities that trigger at the beginning of the end step, and those abilities would trigger now. The end step likely represents the last opportunities players have to interact before the turn ends. And I say likely, talk about that when we get to the cleanup step. The cleanup step is the last step of the turn, and it is where we tie up all the loose ends from earlier in the turn and prepare to pass priority to or pass the turn, sorry, to the next player. There are two turn-based actions associated with this step. First, if the active player has more cards in their hand than their maximum hand size, which is normally 7, they will discard enough cards to get down to their maximum hand size. So if your maximum hand size was 7, like it normally is, and you had 9 cards in your hand, you would discard 2 cards. Then, the second turn based action is any damage that is still marked on permanence is removed, and any effects that last until end of turn or this turn will all end simultaneously, right? Normally, nobody gets priority during the cleanup step. However, after we perform these two turn-based actions, we will check to see if any state-based actions need to be performed or if any abilities triggered during the performing of those two turn-based actions. If there are any state-based actions that need to be performed or abilities that need to get put on the stack, the active player will get priority after those actions are performed or abilities put on the stack. If a player does get priority this way, then there will be another cleanup step. And we will continue to have cleanup steps until we get through the end of one with no state based actions being performed and no abilities being triggered. All right. This is so similar to the whole checking for state based actions and performing triggered abilities, how we keep doing those two things until nothing happens. Same thing with cleanup steps. The cleanup steps will continue until stuff stops happening. Now, there are two phrases, and this was a question that was asked earlier that we can clean up now. So there are two phrases that read similarly, uh, but they do mean different things. And those two phrases are at the beginning of the end step and until end of turn or this turn. We hinted at this a little bit earlier, but the at the beginning of the end step represents a delayed triggered ability. So As an example, check out Turn to Mist, which is not Mist Meta Witch, but very similar. um,
Has
it's
Miss Meadowitch on it. She's there and she's in the
yeah.
vortex.
So this
Awesome.
is the exile target creature, then return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step, right? We have that word at and a trigger condition and an effect. Turn to Mist, when it resolves, creates a delayed triggered ability. This ability will get put on the stack at the beginning of the next end step. So during the end step, right, the first step of the ending phase is when this ability would get put onto the stack. And when it resolves, that creature would return. Now, until end of turn or this turn instead refers to represents a duration for an effect created by a resolving spell or ability. Take, for example, Threaten, which says untap target creature and gain control of it until end of turn. That creature gains haste until end of turn. So when Threaten resolves, you will gain control of a creature and you will retain control of that creature, and that creature will have haste until you get to the cleanup step. And we're performing that turn based action where damage is removed and uh, until end of turn, and this turn effects end. Right now, to go back to a critical difference between this, right? I think it was John was asking the question about this. I think. I don't remember who it was actually. But the question was asked, how do these words interact with something like Sundial of the Infinite? Now, Sundial of the Infinite, I don't have a picture of it, but Sundial of the Infinite is an artifact with an activated ability that just says end the turn. Um, and so what happens with when you end a turn is you skip all of the turns, all of the phases and steps of the turn from where you are, and you go straight to the cleanup step of that turn. You perform the cleanup step and then move along, right? So there, what some people will do is when an end of turn trigger goes on the stack in the ending phase, say the delayed triggered ability from Turn to Mist, they will use an effect like Sundial of the Infinite to end the turn while that trigger is on the stack. Oh, thanks, Quinn. I appreciate you. Um, so they'll to end the turn while that trigger is on the stack, which means that triggered ability will not resolve. Right, the creature you exiled with Turn to Mist will not return to the battlefield. It'll just be exiled, um, and then we'll jump straight to the cleanup step. Right, or and so some people will use cards like Sundial of the Infinite to kind of game that system. Now, you cannot use Sundial of the Infinite to stop the effect of Threaten from expiring, right? If you end the turn during the end step, you still go to the cleanup step. Threaten's effect will expire. The original controller of the creature you threatened will go back to its controller. Like we'll get the card back, right? So if you're trying to game the system, avoid with like threaten or the original printing of Obeka, for example, from Commander Legends, um, avoid cards that read this turn or until end of turn. You're looking specifically for at the beginning of the next end step. And those are the cards that you can sort of cheese with that effect. All right.
Are you teaching people how to cheat at Magic, Brad?
No, I'm teaching them how to appropriately follow the rules of magic.
Okay.
Ah,
All right,
an
okay.
important distinction. Whether what they do with that information is totally up to them. Now, if this all seems like a lot, that's okay because it is a lot. There's a lot that goes on under the hood of a turn under the hood of a turn of the game. There's a lot that goes on with priority and triggered abilities in the stack. It's a whole big complicated system, and it takes a lot of effort to learn, and it's very hard to remember. Fortunately, our friend Katie Combat created a very handy, very comprehensive spreadsheet that walks through all of this information in an easy to follow format. It's color coded, as you can see. Um, it has everything that you need to know about how to get through a turn, how priority passes, actions, and a lot of the stuff that we covered in this presentation. So Steph has just dropped a link in the chat, or you can find the link pinned to Katie's Blue Sky if you want to go drop them a follow. But we are very, very appreciative to Katie for not only taking the time to make this resource, but also for letting us share it with you. So everyone say thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Katie.
All right. Now, um, this was hinted at a little bit earlier with the Mazaveth question, but it's time to check your knowledge once more. So consider with me the card Reconnaissance. This is an enchantment. It has an activated ability. It costs 0 to mana to activate, and it reads remove target creature from target attacking creature you control from combat and untap it. What is the last step in which you can activate Reconnaissance?
All right.
And Steph's going to put a poll in the chat for us. You can see the options on screen. Um, so please, I want to hear your thoughts. Some of you may know the answer to this question from experience, um, but we'll talk about why afterward. Reconnaissance is another card on my list of favorite cards.
I feel like I'll spoil the answer, so I don't want to
Yeah,
contribute
you
to
don't.
how much I like Reconnaissance.
Yeah,
But
you don't want to give it away, but it is an excellent card. War favors the informed, after all, at least according to the flavor text of Reconnaissance.
oh my gosh, that's so funny. That's so great because it's a better card if you know how to play the game straight.
Yes.
Oh, that's incredible.
All right. So it looks like for those that answered it, they know what's up. They know the secret sauce of Reconnaissance. The correct answer here is B, the end of combat step. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but creatures are considered attacking creatures until the end of combat step ends, which means you can um, you can activate reconnaissance. Like your creatures are legal targets for reconnaissance all the way through the end of combat step. So you can, strictly speaking, target them and untap them and remove from combat after they've dealt their combat damage. Now you'll see in the reminder text that creature, it says that creature neither deals nor receives combat damage this turn. If you activate reconnaissance during the combat damage or end of combat step, we are not retroactively undoing all the damage that those creatures dealt or took, right? This is if you activate this after your creatures have already dealt damage, your creatures have still dealt and received damage. It's just the way it goes. But yes, so you can activate reconnaissance during the declare attacker step if you want. You can activate it during the declare blocker step to remove your attacking creatures from unfavorable blocking situations, right? And you can activate it in the combat damage or end of combat damage step to just simply have them be untapped. It's just a thing. Now, if anyone gives you guff about this ruling, just point them to the Assassin's Creed printing of reconnaissance because its reminder text does say if you activate during end of combat, the creature will untap after it deals combat damage. There you go. A much easier source than trying to explain the concepts of a turn and priority passes and all that. Cool. Now, just trying to get through an entire turn by observing every step and priority pass would bog the game down a lot. Seriously, if you want to try it sometime, get a buddy and just play a turn or two of Magic where each of you vocalizes every passive priority. You go through every step, taking all the actions the rules dictate. It would take so long, it would not be very fun. It's a mess,
Or you
right?
could play the niche micro format Judge Tower.
Or you could play the niche microformat Judge Tower, which I've heard is a lot of fun, but I haven't had the chance to play
Yeah,
yet.
uh-huh. It requires you to play everything that you possibly can as quickly as you possibly can at the earliest you can possibly play it.
Yep,
Including all possible priority passes and all of that. So,
it's a whole thing.
yeah.
So for non-Judge Tower formats, um, there's this concept known as shortcuts that we can use to make the game feel more normal. And we do this all the time, right? Without ever knowing that shortcuts exist, this is a thing that happens. But essentially, you can propose a series of actions you want to take or a place in your turn that you want to jump to. And as long as everyone's okay with it, we can just sort of skip ahead to that point, right? Now, when you propose a shortcut, any player can propose an earlier stop to that shortcut if they would like to act before then. And so instead of skipping to when you say you wanted to end the shortcut, we would skip to the point of the turn that player wanted to go to when they have priority so that they can perform their action. And if someone else does cut a shortcut short, you are not held to continuing the shortcut, right? We just pretend the shortcut ends. So, like, for example, the first one here that we'll talk about as an example of a shortcut is pass the turn. And pass the turn generally means I would like to pass priority as many times as are necessary to end my turn. So a lot of times, right, you're in your like especially in the early turns of a game when you're not going to combat, you're not doing stuff in your second main phase, you don't have abilities that trigger at your end step, you might just say pass the turn, right? And if everyone's okay with it, we'll just skip to your cleanup step, do the thing, your turn is over. Um, if someone, for example, were to say, in your end step, I would like to do a thing, then instead we would skip ahead to your end step. That player would do their thing. And then, if you would like, right, you are not required to continue passing priority just because you said you wanted to end the turn. You will then get priority afterward and you can take actions still in your end step if you would like. Another common shortcut that you'll see is I'll activate this ability some number of times. That shortcut is generally means I'm going to activate this ability once and let it resolve. And I'm going to do that process X number of times. And we'll talk about why that matters in the next slide. The last one we'll talk about is a shortcut for go to combat. And since the combat step is incredibly complicated, of course, the shortcut to go to combat is also incredibly complicated. So, not it's not incredibly complicated, but it is nuanced. So let's talk about it. So, if you don't have any effects that trigger at the beginning of combat, this shortcut generally means that you want to skip straight to the declare attacker's step. Conversely, if you do have an effect that triggers at the beginning of combat, this shortcut generally means that you want to go to the beginning of combat step where that ability will trigger. If a player wants to respond, like you say, I'll go to combat, and someone else says, well, before that, right? That shortcut, when a player wants to cut that shortcut short, that player is generally assumed to be acting in the beginning of combat step, unless there are effects that trigger at the beginning of combat, in which case that player would be acting still in the main phase. And the reason why this distinction matters, in addition to if you get into tournament magic, it was a whole controversy about it. You can look it up if you want. But the reason why this matters is we talked about it at the beginning, the first knowledge check we did about if you say you want to go to combat and I want to act in your main phase, are we still in your main phase? Right. These shortcuts exist to allow players to make strategic game decisions while not having to say the exact right words to make that information clear to the other players, right? So it's generally considered strategically beneficial to act in the beginning of combat phase unless you're trying to respond to a beginning of combat trigger, right? So we assume that if there isn't a beginning of combat phase or a beginning of combat trigger that you want to act in or that you want to respond to, we assume that you're taking the strategically beneficial decision of acting during the beginning of combat phase so that the active player can't then cast a creature or an enchantment or whatever before they get into combat after your response. Does that make sense? We'll do an example here just to demonstrate why why these shortcuts exist. So, as an example, consider Crypt Ripper, which is I shouldn't have chosen a name with two words that sound that similar. That's going to trip me up. But it's a 2/2 with haste, and it has an activated ability for one black mana that gives it +1/+1 until end of the turn. So if you wanted to activate this ability 4 times, and it would be reasonable if you wanted to say, I'll activate Crypt Ripper's ability 4 times. Ta-da! Now, if you put all four of those abilities on the stack, one after another, without letting them resolve, then someone could come along with a lightning bolt and just deal 3 damage to your Crypt Ripper and kill it before it gets big enough to survive the lightning bolt. You've now just wasted 4 mana for no benefit. It's unfortunate. However, if instead you were to activate Crypt Ripper's ability once and let it resolve, right? You are now giving your opponents the least amount of information to respond to. So if you were going to activate it again and someone wanted to respond with a lightning bolt so they could kill it before it gets bigger, you still have mana, right? That you haven't spent yet. You can now decide if you're okay with Crypt Ripper dying and saving that 2 mana, or if you want to activate the ability again in response to Lightning Bolt so that it resolves first. Your Crypt Ripper becomes a 4/4. Lightning Bolt doesn't kill it.
Yeah. So, and I remember I've gotten to a couple games because we play games with a lot of strangers, and there are occasionally people that really want to flex their rules knowledge on us,
Mm-hmm.
and like flex that they know how priority works, right? And there's like, I'm gonna hold priority and activate this a bunch of times, um, and I don't think they take the next step and realize that like that's actually strategically not advantageous for you to do.
Yeah.
Um, but so yeah, like understanding when holding priority is a good idea versus when it's not is important. But there are times when holding priority is important.
Yes. So let's talk about that. So, like we said, these shortcuts exist to allow players to easily communicate information without like leaving an opportunity for someone else to gotcha with like, aha, you didn't say the exact right words, so now I can take advantage of your lack of rules knowledge. However, we do still also want players to be able to have the level of customization that we want, right? So generally, while it's generally assumed that when you are casting a spell, you want that spell to resolve, so you are going to immediately pass priority after you put that spell on the stack because most of the time that's the strategically beneficial way to do it. Um, so that way we're not going like, well, I'm going to cast my creature and then pass priority every time you cast a spell or activate an ability that you don't immediately want to respond to, right? However, um, there are times when you do want to take an action and before that action resolves, take another action, right? So if you want to do that, how do you communicate that? So you may have heard players like Steph said, you may hear players say something like, I'll hold priority. And this is where that information becomes useful, right? So after you take your first action, or as you're taking that first action, you can say, I'll hold priority to let the other players know that you're going to take another action while you still have priority so that they don't immediately jump in with responses if they have them. So, for example, right? Say you have a lightning bolt and you want to copy it with reverberate, right? You're welcome, Quinn. A very red example. Um, right? Reverberate copies an instant or sorcery spell still on the stack. So if you cast lightning bolt and let it resolve, then reverberate won't have anything to target, right? So you could say something like, "I'm going to cast lightning bolt and hold priority, and then I'll cast Reverberate, targeting Lightning Bolt." So now everyone is on the same page that you now are putting two spells on the stack consecutively without letting the first one resolve. Does that make sense to everyone? Right?
That's why double major works the way that it does, right? You
Yeah.
cast a creature and then you hold priority and then you cast double major.
Yeah. I think because Double Major copies a creature spell, right?
Sure does.
Yeah. So if you have questions, now is a great time to ask them as we're getting into our final boosty break of the day.
Ooh.